I've been thinking a lot about what I might say to you today. I've been thinking about it for some time. And as I prepared my first manuscript, I sent it off to some trusted readers, and they gave me really great feedback, including several incredibly important things that I honestly don't have time to cover in this one session. So what was born is what is going to become a preaching series, and we will come back to some things. And I want you to think about that as I talk about what we will hear today, because I want your feedback. I want to know how you saw yourself in what I'm going to talk about, and also where you didn't, where you're hoping I might come back to. And I promise, as long as that sounds like a place where God be okay with us going, we will come back to it. We have time. So a series is born, and today we're going to be talking love. I mean loving relationship. I mean Christian love. And today I'm going to begin, as a series should, with the telos point, the vision, the place we're headed. And Jesus casts a vision for loving relationships. Now in 2 weeks, I'm going to come to one of the more challenging aspects of relationship, and that's communication. On Pentecost Sunday, see where we're headed? And we're going to talk about things like conflict and forgiveness and the work of relationships, and one of my favorite topics, sex. We're going to talk about that. And I'm also going to ask you, as I said, to let us know what else you hope we cover. But today is the telos point. And I want to talk to you about what Jesus teaches us about love in relationship should look like. And I'm going to specify the kind of relationships I'm talking about. I hope to debunk some of the more problematic teachings you will have heard on this topic, and hopefully that can help to heal some of the pain and anguish that we've experienced over the course of the centuries. And I'm going to get real specific on what Jesus says about love. Then I'm going to try to help you get a clearer vision of what Christian love can look like for you. Now, clever folk that you are, I'm sure you're wondering which relationships I'm talking about, and that is a great question. In general, what I'm going to say is that I'm talking about the relationships, the love that we choose. I'm not going to specify that much further on that because I'm going to develop this point, but it's the love that you choose. And what I will say is that no matter where you are romantically, this sermon will be for you, because we're all called into loving relationship. We are not all called into marriage, or if we were, maybe that's a beautiful part of our past. But we're still always called into love. Love is the telos, the destination. But if marriage is the destination of love, we actually wind up missing God's point. Marriage is just one expression of Christian loving. And honestly, I share this to take the pressure off and to say no matter what's going on in your life, there's a way to examine the relationships that we choose to see if they're aligned with God's vision for loving relationship. So yes, I'm going to talk about dating and marriage, but we could apply this to any of the relationships in our lives. That's a tall order, so let's get started. Will you pray with me? Holy God, we give you thanks that we have the privilege to pray. We have the privilege to walk back into conversation with you to see what you might have, what wisdom, what guidance, what vision you might have for our lives right this moment. We have a chance to listen. We have a chance to ask you to open our eyes so that we might see. all that you have in store for me, O God. And may the words of this mouth and the meditations of all of these hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. And if the church might agree, would it say, Amen. Amen. So, to begin, I'm just going to share, congregation, that I have done well more than my fair share of research on this topic of love and relationship and what it should not look like. I kissed a lot of frogs to get me to this point to have something to share. So please learn from me. A quick example. You might not know, if you haven't known me for more than 10 years, that I spent quite some time dating the beautiful person who is now my husband. I spent a lot of time dating him without realizing that we were dating. He knew, or at least he hoped he knew, but I didn't know. And it was really beautiful. As he would discover more and more about me and what interested me, he would plan these beautiful outings, which is what I thought they were, that he knew would interest me and him. And I should explain that when we met, I was only in town where he was for 3 months, and it was winter, and it was Minneapolis. It was the coldest winter that Minneapolis, which y'all already know is cold, it was the coldest one they had booked for 100 years. I was so cold, and I was ready to be out of there in 3 months, serve the church I was serving well, and then get out of Dodge. This man was determined. He wanted me to have a good experience while I was out there, and thanks to him, I did. But over those 3 months, as I shared news of our outings with my colleagues, they would laugh, and then they would gently correct me and say, Kaji, you know that's a date, right? And the answer is I had no clue, none, because it hadn't even occurred to me, honestly. But obviously I changed my mind later, thank God. But there's something curious and instructive about my lack of understanding that it never quite dawned on me that we were dating until it did. Because you know why I didn't know? Because I had zero clue what healthy dating was. Look, I had dated quite a bit. Just before my exile to Minneapolis, I was hot stuff living in New York City. I had a dating app and I had many evenings free. I dated like it was my job, and that's exactly how I treated it. If the demands of my ministry were not that heavy that day, it wouldn't be unusual for me to go to work on job number 2, finding my husband. And sometimes I'd have multiple dates on the same day, just efficient. And candidates, if you will, would show up for this appointment with me, and the dates were part of my mathematical calculation. This is a city of 8.5 million people, lots of whom were single men, my population of choice. But let's say we narrow that number down to a cool million. Clearly, since I lived in the village, he'd have to live in Manhattan, because I would not be taking the subway to Brooklyn or anywhere else to be with him. And preferably, he would actually live south of 59th Street, because I couldn't stand coming up here to the Upper East Side. Back in those days, I don't know why, but every time I came up here, someone would do something very racist to me. So I just kind of avoided the Upper East Side. And he needed to live on the 4, 5, or 6 train, or the N or the R, because that would just be, you get this, right? It's hard to get around in New York City. But the math was still in my favor. I had plenty of dates, and lots of them liked me, until we got into the what do you do conversation. When you're a pastor, that's tricky. But at job number 2, I scheduled dates like they were meetings. I had absolutely no expectations, except that I expected the men to be terrible. And that way, when they were, it wasn't a surprise. I figured To work through the math on this one, I had to have, for those of you who think mathematically, I had to have a big N, lots of numbers, until we could sort through and find the right husband. He was here somewhere, hopefully not in Brooklyn, somewhere on this island, south of 59th Street, on the east side if you lived above 14th Street. Do I sound like a terrible person? I wasn't. What I was smart, pretty, heartbroken. I had no expectations of love, just the practical desire to have a roommate I was attracted to who would take on some difficult aspect of my life that I couldn't handle on my own. That was what I wanted. Does that sound awful? I hope it doesn't. Because as someone who has literally officiated for hundreds of Christian marriages, it's a pretty common perspective. Folks might not articulate it exactly as I have for you right now, but this is a real point of view. And think about it. How many people do you know who think or have thought that way, right? And I'd say that what I described is probably the second most common, honest set of expectations of romantic relationships that I've encountered as a pastor. But the most common is this one, especially for a first marriage. A lot of folks are looking for someone to be on that aisle with. What do I mean? To either walk down or stand on this aisle. Tell you how many people I have officiated weddings for and gone through marriage counseling with who are looking for a person to be somewhere on this aisle. Their marriage aspirations end at the wedding event. Not even really at the ceremony, but at the wedding event. And they have no vision for what the marriage would be like. You think that I'm blaming them for this? I'll say that it's not their, or if that's you, it's not your fault. We, and I mean we writ large, such a poor job helping people to visualize what marriage actually is, might look like to be healthy. Just think about it. How many of the rom-coms have you ever seen that, sorry, my husband was pointing to me, but it looks like he was talking to me. Okay. How many rom-coms have you ever seen that end at the wedding? Right there. They're right here, and then it's like, credits roll. That's it. I watch a lot of them, especially around Christmas, the Hallmark ones, and they're always like off in some made-up country, and they get to the altar, and then somebody becomes a princess or queen, and then that's the end. That's what we help you with your imagination to see. And preachers don't really help. Consider, how many men stand in pulpits talking about their rules for marriage that they have no intention of following? Folks in the pews are in on the do as I say, not as I do scam, which is why so few actually end up trying even to practice what's preached. What happens instead, we get some sort of vague, legalistic view of what Christian marriage is and what it looks like. You can just go to Ephesians chapter 5 for the list. We receive some rules that are vaguely embedded into our cultural assumptions about what Christian marriage is. Some of that gets written into law. We might even try to live out the rules in earnest. But more likely, and this is just statistically anyway, we don't actually live them out and don't even want to. And a number of people who do try to pull off the Ephesians 5 marriage then set up this dichotomy between what they think is required of them and what they actually do. You notice I'm not here preaching on Ephesians 5. There's a reason for that. It's a good text. I'm just not going to say it's a form of how you think about marriage. It's, it's about complementarity with the woman submitting to the man, all that. Not getting into that. What I will get into is how preachers like me don't actually help either. Because it's very rare that I talk about relationship, mostly because I don't want to leave somebody out. It's scary. I don't want to be talking about love, and you're like, I don't want that. Thanks, Pastor, you made me feel terrible. I don't want that. And I'm also worried about what's been implanted in your heads because I wonder, whomst am I to even begin to claim to have a clue on how we pull this off, to give you a guidebook? But if not me, whom? And if not now, when? So what does that have to do with our text? I'll give you the short answer. Whenever Jesus talks about fishing, the fish, you know what they are, right? People. That's just a general rule, applies across every single gospel. Fish are people. And in this passage that my friend Liz Meyer taught me to call the Jesus fish fry, these guys are out on the boat trying to catch fish, and they're failing. They put in all this toil, like it was their job, to catch fish, and then they were failing miserably. They were looking in all the wrong places. Anybody know that song? Whooping, putting up. Meanwhile, it's an Eddie Murphy joke. Meanwhile, the fish were right in front of them. Right in front of them. They just needed Jesus to show them what was already there. Because the thing is that which you are seeking and that God intends, it's already right in front of you. You will see what God intends for you with God's help. But for many of us, we just have to be willing to look differently. So often, we are so busy giving God some limitations. Manhattan, south of 59th Street, east side. But your blessing does not depend on your list. I know. Somebody probably told you that you just need to make your list and lay it out for God or the universe or whatever, and you, or I'm not sure if it's you or God or the universe, but somebody is going to manifest. And if that sounds like you, honey, go for it. You manifest. You make your list. But let's hope your list is real good. Because I can guarantee whoever told you to manifest, it was somebody, but it wasn't Jesus. And don't get me wrong. I'm not against the overall concept. I just want to hone it so that it's theologically sound. Generally speaking, you are on the wrong track if you want to tell God what to do. Make sense? All right, so start there. If your list is really just an instruction sheet for God, if you wind up being the one making the commands, not a good plan. But if you humbly state your intentions before the Lord your God, and you say, "This is the vision I have, O Ancient of Days." And then you humbly ask, "Did the vision come from you, God? My help and my strength?" I firmly believe that in the fullness of time, you will receive an answer to that. And there's a story I love about this. My girlfriends call it the Julius Prayer story, and it starts with a woman following the suggestion of one of her good friends, a friend who told her to name and proclaim in prayer exactly what she was looking for in a mate. She was instructed to be real specific, so she was. Here's what she said. "God, you have not heard from me in a long time. I know you're surprised. My name is Viola Davis. I want a big black man who's an ex-athlete, preferably a football player, because I love football players. I really want him to be black, but he doesn't have to be black, God. I mean, at the end of the day, I really want him to be black, God, and I love a Southern man. I love countrymen, God. I want somebody real country. And I don't want any pressure to have children, so I want him to have had a wife before me and children already, so that's settled. I want someone who trusts in you and loves you, God, because then he will be accountable to someone, you, God." And that was her prayer. And I love this. Now, one way to read this is that she told God what to do. But I don't see it that way, because I don't think God works that way. What I do think is that when Viola got on her knees to pray, she was willing to receive God's vision of love for her. And as she said this out loud, as she prayed to come into alignment with God's intentions for her, she prepared herself to be ready for her Julian, the man to whom she has now been married for almost 20 years. The man with whom, and I love this, she starts every day, every morning in the jacuzzi, and ends her night every night with the soak in the tub. I love that. That love is a blessing, and every blessing comes from God. And what I think happened is that in her prayers, God gave her the gift of sight, so that when her blessing came, she would have the wisdom to see it. But you know what, though? Even though she had that vision, and she was pulling herself into closer alignment with God, she wasn't ready for that love quite yet, because her vision of love was incomplete. She had to come to love herself before she could fully take on and take in this blessing. And when we don't open ourselves up to that alignment, we end up looking for love in all the wrong places. It's you. That's not your fault. Like I said, I haven't helped you with this, and all too often church fails at it miserably. But on today, I really hope that God will get us together. I told you I was dating the man who would become my husband without my even knowing it, because I had no idea what it meant for a romantic partner to behave with loving intention. No clue. I didn't have a vision for it, so I couldn't see it right in front of me. And furthermore, and perhaps more importantly, I had no idea how to love myself. I was looking to pour out love from an empty well. I was fishing in the East Village when my catch was all the way in Minneapolis. And then when I found him, I didn't even know it. I was standing on that boat, hopelessly searching. And I needed Jesus to say, look the other way. When you are on that boat and you feel like you're stuck fishing, and I actually hate fishing, but let's say you're on the boat and you feel like you're stuck fishing. You're probably doing your best, you feel like you are, but when God says, look the other way, God is also saying, I know it feels like you can't do this. And you're right, you can't do it on your own. And God's saying, I know you've been searching and seeking, and you feel like you can't keep at it no more. I know this has been exhausting, and the boat is rocky, and you're seasick, and the sun is hot and scorching, and your net keeps coming up empty, or you get dead fish, or a super... You catch an old shoe? Look, I know. But look here. Look here. What does this mean? I think we start by looking right here in the mirror. Mama Rue puts it very succinctly and accurately when she asks, if you can't love yourself, how in the hell are you going to love somebody else? I get an amen. So let me be real clear. The point to Christian love is this. This love thing isn't right when we only focus on one kind of love. It must be tripartite, 3 parts. Christian love is always, let's call it a 3-legged stool, a stool with 3 legs. Now, when your stool is supposed to have 3 legs and you've only got 2, it's not going to hold your weight, right? And if it only has 1, still won't. That just won't do. Instead, love God, love neighbor, love yourself. There's no shortcuts to this. And that may sound harsh, what I'm about to say, but I do believe it. In the tripartite love formula, your intended, your beloved, your betrothed is just a neighbor. A neighbor you might covenant to spend your life with, but still That's a neighbor. And there are other neighbors. And they're right there in front of you, ready to be part of the love equation in your life. They may not be covenant partners, but they're important. And God puts these people in our lives so that we will always have an opportunity to fulfill what God has commanded us to do, to love. Because remember, whatsoever God asks of you, God will give you the means to carry through. And I think one of the things that we get so wrong about marriage in church is that we have you so hyper-focused on who you marry and the rules for your marriage, that we fail to teach you the very basics of love. And those basics of love start with having a laser focus on what Jesus was focused on. If the partners in a marriage live by that threefold love command, they will find completion. But Jesus wasn't focused on finding the one. That was not important to him. Let me prove it to you. I'm asking this really, who was the officiant at Cana? Who officiated for that wedding? Anyone know? Did Rabbi Jesus do the honors? Does the text tell us that? No, it sure doesn't. What did Rabbi Jesus do at Cana? He was busy restocking the bar, y'all. And to be honest, I'm not surprised, are you? Because Jesus was not about our one-on-one relationships. He was about the community. He was about the people, the collective, the guests as a whole. Jesus was focused on their refreshment and joy. He was helping them to live their best lives, to live life and to live it abundantly. And Jesus was never married himself. But here we are, teaching you that you're incomplete if you don't find a mate or if you lose one. That your primary purpose is to wed in bed someone who will complete you. And how you define your love life. I'm so sorry, but it won't work. It's not enough. No human can complete you. It's just not the answer. The answer to the love question is always love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. There's your infinity ring. Anything else is just metal. And if that sounds harsh, I think it sounds harsh until you really think about it. Because what I'm trying to do is liberate you from these expectations. Most of you listening right now are unmarried. How dare I tell you that you're not complete and that you can't be? Some of you listening right now are joyously married, and I celebrate with you that you found that particular neighbor. So did I. I like a good marriage. Many of you are in very loving relationships that haven't called on that covenant. And I celebrate your love for those neighbors as well. And a good number of you are saying, well, what about us? And I left this for last on this list because you might just need this message the most. And this applies to marriages, but actually to any friendship or any relationship you choose. I see you. I see you who are in relationships that do not affirm your belovedness. I see you putting in so much that it leaves you weak. I see you feeling stuck because you've got a lease or a mortgage or a car payment or little ones depending on you or some sort of contract. I see you feeling like you have failed at love, like it's not for you. But verily, I tell you this, you didn't fail. Neither did God. That vision failed. It ended up not being right, and that is not your fault. That is not your fault. And in just about every situation I know of where this is the case, actually all of them, you wound up in that relationship because you couldn't pull off part 3 of the love command, loving yourself. You did the best you could with what you had at the time, with the vision you had at the time. And if this applies to you, would you please say that to yourself? Actually, this applies to anyone in any circumstance. I did the best I could with the vision I had at the time. And whatever vision for love you get when you don't love yourself, it's not going to work. It'll drag you down. It will harm you further. It will need to be set aside, which, with God's help, will happen. Beloved, you may have been looking off before, but God's saying, look here in your heart. And when you get that new vision from God, a vision that leaves room for you to love God and neighbor and self, then you can assess how and where this person is in this new vision, in the new picture, the one in which you love yourself. Maybe they're right there. Or maybe loving that particular neighbor needs to happen from more of a distance. Talk that over with God. Whatever you do, you'll know you're on the right track if you start feeling really secure in your belovedness. And this isn't radical Christian teaching, by the way. I'm just telling you what Jesus said. Love God, neighbor, self. And lots of preachers tell you things about love that Jesus never said, but you need to understand that this isn't even a radical Christian interpretation on love. Has anyone ever read Kierkegaard? But when you start to think of a mate, a helpmate, if you will, as just a neighbor, you do realize that it takes the pressure off. I mean, not all your neighbors live in your house, right? Some need to be on the other side of town or the earth. And I offer this to you because this shift in perspective gives you some freedom. It opens up so many possibilities of acknowledging the love you already have in your life. If you just look this way. I do want you to have a helpmeet if that's a relationship you're called into. I just know that too many times when folks are married, that's not always the case. They can be, but marriage doesn't just magically make that happen. In fact, helpmeet as a concept comes from Genesis 2, your origin story. And in that context, you remember what God said about how they, Ish and Isha, would relate to each other? On their way out of the garden, God is like, by the way, you will be nipping at each other's feet sometimes. You will know pain sometimes, but I will cover you because you are mine. And this is a major part of why we're meant to live in community. Let's say we focus all of our loving energy on one person. A lot of people do. How many times do we lose friends when they find someone they consider a mate? How many times have you or someone you know or love disappeared into a relationship, a romantic relationship? Love is not about isolation. Isolation is a breeding ground for abuse. And then when we do this, when we isolate and then we wind up in conflict, just as God said that we would, if we haven't all along been practicing loving ourselves and loving God and loving our neighbors, we end up in a really, really lonely place or worse. Look, for something to hold theological weight, it's gotta apply in any circumstance. It has to work, not just in some situations, but all of them. And we don't mention that from places like that, like here, very often because it sets a really, really high bar. But that's why Jesus took care of that for us by saying that everything gets distilled to this: love God, neighbor, self. And when the disciples listened, when they turned their gaze to where God was asking them to look, their nets were full. Jesus was never focused on finding them the one. Jesus was focused on showing you your neighbors, the ones whom God is putting right in front of you to love. And then, once you find them, come back with me to the beach, to the end of a hot day where, by the grace of God, your labor has not been in vain, where you're invited to jump off the boat and plunge into the waters and swim to the shore and join the Lord your God, waiting for you at the fish fry, and sit for a spell. See your God-given community, your neighbors. Smile at your beloved. Say a prayer of gratitude to the one who fills your life with love right now. The Jesus fish fry is a love feast, and if you don't believe me, just listen to Jesus, the only thing he talked about on that shore. Do you love me? Feed my lambs. Do you love me? Take care of my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. And right there, Jesus covers tripartite love. Remember, love yourself. That's exactly what he was doing in saying that 3 times to Peter. Remember, it helped him to be freed from his shame. Love yourself, love God, tend to your community, which means love your neighbor. Do these 3 and you will be one. You will be whole. So, beloved, let God focus your gaze. Plunge into God's vision. And when you do, feel the warm sand beneath your feet. Hear the waves lapping on the shore. Fill your belly with good food. Live into your birthright, your belovedness. Enjoy a meal that is well seasoned and just right for you and everything you need. Just look here. Look here. Look here. Amen.